The New Convert's Pet, Chapter 1. Forward by Cardinal Bishop Ash Barlow. This book is a novelization of the true events that led to Stephen Puiox's conversion and ascension as champion, this leading to the massive shift in the dogma of our church. It is the product of 3 decades of work tracking down and compiling the journal entries of Champion Elder Michael, Claire Puiox, and Lewis Clark, letters that the Death Fists wrote to each other and other members of the church, interviews with those that were present but left the group before the Pelorian attack, interviews with those who were not spared or had passed on before that dark day and were willing to speak to me during seances or trips to the celestial plane, McCool himself, and most fully the long recollections of my mentor, Lovan Cohn. Should any witnesses to these events find my depictions inaccurate, I deeply apologize and would be happy to correct these errors in later editions. Should this not be enough for you, then I say that you should have spoken to me during the several years that I was sending out hundreds of letters and traveling the world requesting input. In later chapters where I mention my own role and influence, please understand that while I am full of myself, the occurrences are also fully true. I would like to dedicate this book to both Lovan Cohn and Stephen Puiox himself, who without the storytelling of and the man who was in the stories, I would have given up hope long ago. Elder Michael basked in the scent of fire and blood. They had been camping where any bounty hunter would be too lazy to find them. Then they ran into an orc war party who'd been thinking the same thing. After a few days of boredom in the wintry woods, Michael set his flock loose to do what they did best: murder. They had picked them off in little raids over several nights, captured, maimed, and tortured a few before they sent them back for intimidation, spilled their men's entrails and ripped out muscle and bone when they left dead bodies to make them think it was some stalking beast, released a few nasty diseases that cut their ranks to a reasonable number, cast a few illusions to make them think their gods were angry with them, and then came the beautiful and total assault, where now there was nothing left but fading echoes of life and red snow. Oh, how his fighters had trembled with excitement, been giddy with the glee of creating gore. They lived for death. They lived for destruction. And while not the complete destruction of every breathing, thinking, and creeping thing that they so craved, that they truly desired, that their god commanded, wiping out an entire people was good practice, as well as good fun. As he breathed in his flock's laughter while they ran to and fro, he shared in their momentary contentment with what they had done. They would worship, they would feast, they would pick the camp clean, and then they would set out to find some other place to do it again. The non-combatants of their group arrived as the battle was over. A few non-magical medics or more bookish types, elders, previously injured fighters still on the mend, and their handful of child or teen recruits that needed more training before they'd be ready for war. 3 were progeny of members of the cult, and there was an additional member of their group who was currently pregnant. Who fathered who, they'd never know what with the orgies, but it took a village either way, so it wasn't like it truly mattered what last name a baby ended up with. They were all children of Merkul. As far as other notables, there was Lewis Clark, Michael's own warlock, passing down the power he got from Merkul in addition to his own demonic power to a third party. A third party who was lanky, sassy, flamboyant, incredibly attractive, and not at all afraid to ensure that everyone knew these facts about him. Uniquely, the team was a quarter dragonborn. He had short, dark hair, eyes always ringed in eyeliner, and his forearms faded down from sun-kissed skin into scales, his hands ending in long gold claws. The rest of his otherwise human body was brushed with occasional speckles of gold scales in the same places freckles would be. The young man wore little, even on the edge of the tundra they'd been staying near lately, typically just tight leather pants, boots, and maybe a flowing cotton shirt. He claimed he was just hot-blooded by heritage, but few people minded the view, and those that critiqued or teased him only did so until he found a verbal way to roast them back. Michael agreed with the draconian heritage excuse, though. He had touched every inch of Lewis, and he was pretty hot. Lewis had been a working boy that Michael happened to lease at a red light district tavern on one of their rare trips into an actual town. Lewis was so worth the money that Michael offered to buy him out of his contract if he entered a warlock contract and traveled with them. He wasn't much of a fighter yet, but he was learning, and while he respected Merkul, he wouldn't bend the knee to anyone unless he was about to use his mouth for something else. These occasions were also the only time he stopped mouthing off. But he was an incredible lay and quick-witted enough to have promise, so Michael put up with his antics and taught him Eldritch Blast to keep him around. Another pledge was a very young girl named Claire Puiox. She had told everyone that she was 15, but Michael suspected it was closer to 12. She had long hair and braids that she maintained as best she could, dark skin, and a face that had become softly rounded as she'd been actually eating since joining the flock. They'd picked her up in a port town after seeing her ex, one of her few possessions, swing at another beggar child who had tried to steal from her. Desperate, lonely, naive, and possessing loose morals, she would someday make a great addition to the group. The non-combatants started picking through things and putting out fires while others licked their wounds or let others help them lick their wounds. They drank the orcs' wine and rifled through their pockets for anything overtly interesting, though thorough looting would take place later. It was at this time Michael heard somebody exclaim, "Fuck!" and several people jumped back from the orcs' block of cages on the edge of camp. The other cages had been emptied as the orcs trained wargs, large wolfish creatures that made excellent attack dogs, and had set them loose on his people during the fight. Michael came over as it was apparent that something the orcs possessed was still alive, and currently growls screaming like a mountain lion. Michael then realized, in addition to it having a mountain lion-sounding call, mountain lions usually uncannily sounding like people screaming, this creature had 5-fingered humanoid hands that they slammed against the bars as they were provoked and were being threatening in response. While it had a thumb, its other fingers were twisted into crooked claws. The rest of it was indiscernible, a matted and muddy mound of what might have been its own fur or maybe even leather that it was wearing. It looked like blood and gore, its own or that of its meals, was also matted into the hair and mange. Perhaps the orcs had not let it out to fight along with the others because it was injured or had rabies or something. Whatever it was clear that it was frightened and wanted to be left alone, clearly expressing that by viciously lashing at the cage and growl screaming. "Back up, back up," Michael droned as he walked over, shooing his people away. "Good practice to put this thing down, boss," one of his fighters, still drooling in his hunger for death, said with a toothy grin. "We can cut it up and see what it is." Michael couldn't help but roll his eyes and remember why he'd been Merkul's champion for over 500 years now. Very few of the others applied tactics to their bloodlust. "We'll see if it's useful before we kill it." "It could be a new monster we could use," a more intelligent one gasped. Michael shooed them even further away, and the thing, now that it wasn't surrounded from all sides, pressed itself into the back of its cage. It still growled, but not as loudly, panting and trembling with adrenaline. Michael was tall and broad-shouldered, so he knelt in the snow to frighten it less. He embraced his demonic wiles, keeping his human form but testing how he could charm the creature, closing his eyes to see through the creatures instead. Surface thoughts alone, this thing was terrified, miserably cold, in horrible pain to the point of insanity, but more than anything on Earth, it was hungry. The creature was so hungry that it made Michael feel hungry, and so he produced food for it, a potato that he'd taken off an orc's last cook fire, and tossed it to the edge of the cage where the thing could get it. Michael didn't feel like it was a good idea to put his fingers anywhere near the bars. The thing froze. Michael couldn't see its eyes if it had any, but the thing had turned as the potato touched down and was locked with its head facing it, presuming that it was a head and not just a weird lump under the mud and hair or something. The creature's hands shook so hard that they made audible thumps against the slushy and half-melted ice that was the only thing it had for a floor. It twitched forward but then locked itself even harder to the back of the cage again. Michael sensed fear overcome even the incredible hunger now. Michael backed away and motioned for his people to go back even further. After a moment, inch by agonizing inch, the thing crept toward it, about to shake itself apart as its crooked fingers neared the horizon of the bars, and in a flash the lump was snatched up and disappeared. Michael saw a raw and jagged hole for a mouth only for a moment, as the creature crushed up the food in its hands and its teeth as it nearly swallowed the potato whole, and most assuredly ate some of its hair and filth along with it. The thing slammed itself into the back of the cage and yelped as it covered its head with its arms, choking as it swallowed and curled into a vibrating ball so tight that its limbs were indiscernible again. The only thing in its mind now was panic. Michael perceived flashes of green hands, fire, violence, infected wounds, blood, thousands of memories of agony by tusk-filled smiles, and more than 1,000 images of raw meat and rotten plant matter, or what might have even been orc waste in its mind. The thing thought of boiling water in a pot, and panic overcame it until there was nothing but white and black static, as it became too afraid to have thoughts. Even still, the thing was hungry. The food was gone, but the creature was terrified something was going to take it from them. It was so hungry, but eating meant something horrible was about to happen, and it was hard for Michael to tell what. He dug down from the present and into the past, but no matter where he looked, all he saw was snow, blood, violence, and filth. The only sound in the thing's mind was the sound of its own voice screaming. Every image was seen through a veil of pain and terror and hunger, and literally slightly obscured as he saw through its eyes. He wondered if the thing was partially blind, if its brain manifested memories as fractured images naturally, or if its vision was just that obscured by matted hair. Michael withdrew from it as the second-hand agony and spiral of panic grated on him. It took a moment to clear his thoughts fully, even with Michael's power and experience. The thing's emotions were just so pure, so intense. Michael focused on how the cold wind felt in his graying hair and how the blood still pumped in his arms from swinging his god's holy weapon. The eyes he used to see, white orbs that nearly glowed themselves with power Merkul lent to him to look past veils, turned to the eyes he used to speak. These were red with black irises and gold slits for a pupil, one might say his true eyes. And these turned to the eyes he used to lie, just plain, boring, perfectly average human eyes. As he left it, Michael commanded it to calm down. In its mind, the thing had screamed 1,000 times louder than the already exceptionally loud shrieks it made in real life. It still inwardly screamed, even as it outwardly lowered to a whimper now, forced to obey Elder Michael's magic. Fully separate, Michael watched it twitch a bit as it sat panting. Waiting longer, the thing appeared to weaken or feel faint from exhaustion. It slowly crumpled back to its icy floor, growls and panting turned to wheezes, and then the thing took a deep, shuddering breath as it curled in on itself and finally let out a single, quiet sob. "What is it, boss?" someone asked. Michael heard, but wasn't paying attention to them. There was something much more important. He had noticed that little Claire had joined the circle, and she possessed the look that Michael had seen on many little girls that had watched him murder their parents, siblings, friends, burn their village down, or obliterate their very own lives with godly smite. The face when he crushed their kittens under his heel. The girl's soul was filled with heartbreak. "Sin pain, whatever it is," Michael said while not moving his eyes off Claire, who wasn't taking her eyes off the sad, broken creature. She frowned even further, hearing him say this. I'll teach her that death is merciful today, Michael decided. Claire? He called her. The girl snapped up in mild alarm. Michael rarely spoke to her directly. He waved her over and she sheepishly came, glancing to the thing every few steps on the way. She stood next to him in her traveling furs, hands wringing behind her back even as her arm rested on the axe head that hung on her hip. Similar to how he had lowered his posture to calm the creature, Michael loosened a strap on his armor to take off his breastplate, leaning on it as he still knelt so as to manufacture intimacy between them. The demon/apocalypse god champion gently asked the 12-year-old, You pity it, yes? Her upper lip quivered. Not so much because she was sad, but that combined with being put on the spot in front of the group. Yes, she whispered with a crack to her voice. You see that it is in pain. Yeah. Its pain should end, should it not? Her eyes went wide as she realized what he was saying and desperately hated it. I can help him. I'll take care of him. I'll make him useful, she tearfully declared. Michael nodded calmly, knowing that Claire was hard-headed, and respecting that. The girl was tough and cool-blooded. She lodged her axe in a sailor's chest once during a bar fight, and though they ran away before he fully hit the ground, she hadn't even flinched later when the others were debating if she killed him or not. Yet, when another member took her hunting with them, teaching her how to set traps and use a crossbow, she'd cried for nearly an hour after they made her break a rabbit's neck and did not eat meat again for days until it was all they had. Despite her age, she didn't take flack from anyone, even attempting to kick Lewis's ass a few times when he'd talked down to her. She was in the common phase of recruitment where she enthusiastically condoned killing evil creatures and people, disregarded nebulous lives with little feeling, disliked killing mostly good people even though it was necessary, but it was still very hard to kill things that were completely innocent. Their god forgave them for the sin of wishing to spare dumb beasts, some cuddlier monsters, and young children, however. So long as these mercies did not stand in the way of greater plans, the Dark Lord forgave them. I'll let you take care of it tonight, Michael promised her, both for the lesson and it would give her something to do other than try to sleep while the adults got drunk and high and had communal victory sex. I'll let you take care of it, and if it's better in the morning, I'll let you keep it. But if it is worse or still overtly suffering, we will take it into Merkul's sleep. People and creatures should not suffer for no reason. This is why the entire world should end, after all. I have seen that it knows only pain, and if the only way to end its pain is to end its life, then we are duty and honor bound to do that. You understand? A small tear fell down her cheek, but she nodded. Michael patted her on the shoulder. Take whatever supplies you need. Ask for help if you need. Don't let it bite you, and if you think you can get it to come out of the cage, have Roxy and Laren help you chain it to a tree or something. Michael planned that she would see the futility of helping this thing by morning, that or she would turn on it after she sat in the snow trying to pet it all night, and it took one of her fingers for her trouble. Either way, most of the others broke off in search of food or drink or loot, knowing what Michael was doing, as most of them had gone through the same thing, and they were instantly bored of his preaching. A few watched Claire slowly approach the cage and studied the creature with her for a while. One or two helped her gather up med kits and food for the thing, and as the night set in, most people left her to it. The stench of swamp water filled the nose all the way to the brain. Once the algae and silt touched skin, it would never feel clean again. If a person went below the surface, their eyes and skin would feel sticky and burn even long after they were dry. If a person wore braids in their hair, that smell would absolutely never come out until the braids were cut off. Every bug flew above and every bug swam below, and all of them wanted to bite. One scratch in the deeper waters, and the victim would be dead in a week, turning into the very slime and rot that made the swamp itself. Witches, skunk apes, troglodytes, goblins, trolls, dragons, dragon turtles, the purple worm, all of these roamed the swamp and killed many more than the simple alligator or hippo or boa snake. They hunted the gators because of this, after all. Compared to a dragon, they were easy meat and leather. There was honor in diving off a boat to sink a hatchet into an alligator's spine. It took guts to lash one up, cunning to lure one into a trap, and strong friendship to be crazy or trusting enough to go along with a hunter and help carry the beast back when it was all said and done. Claire's father had died not from a gator, but from a blood disease he caught from a leech while hunting one. He still pulled a 13-footer that day, and while he taught her well, Claire was only 9 at the time, and so in some of his last words, he told her to never go after one that was bigger than she was. She was disobeying him currently, however. He was against the back wall and growling again. Claire couldn't blame him. He'd been treated like a dog. Worse than a dog, really. So it was natural for him to act like one. This man was traumatized to hell and back. He'd obviously gone a little crazy, but it was disgusting how Michael and the others hadn't even tried speaking to him. Claire tried to get him to look at her, to see his face through where his hair had matted into his beard. The frozen blood and mud on his awful moldy rawhide clothes crunched as he moved, cowering away from her. But as she crouched lower, inching through the snow, she saw the one blue eye again. Wide, scared, sad. He might as well have been a puppy in that cage. "Hi," was all she could think to whisper. He blinked and didn't growl at her again, but other than shivering and twitching his broken fingers a little, he was frozen. "I ain't gonna hurt you," Claire promised. Again, he didn't move. Claire found herself frowning, wondering if he couldn't speak or if he was just too scared to. It was probably shock. She'd heard the clerics and medics use that excuse before. "All the orcs are dead. I'll let you out now. You're safe. You're free now. I won't let my friends hurt you." Said friends who were still covered in blood and had bloody weapons and would have killed him moments ago if only they had Michael's permission, were still annoyingly close behind her. They're nice when you get to know them. We're not gonna hurt you." The man was breathing harder the longer he looked at her, locked in terror against the back of the cage. "My name's Claire. What's yours?" He still didn't move, didn't speak. His one feature she could make out didn't change from an expression of fear for even a moment. "Maybe. Oh God, what if he doesn't actually speak? How long have they had him even?" She saw him shudder, and saw a long string of spit from his mouth trail through his beard and onto a spot on his chest, where more ice that was likely also spit had fallen and frozen. Looking more into his tangled beard, she saw red through the hair, and places where it looked like more blood had dropped and frozen too. The man instinctively wiped some of it away, moving for the first time and only his shaking hand. His nails were long and broken, the tips of his fingers froth-smitten, and each of them crooked and just bent wrong. For only a moment, Claire wondered if Elder Michael was right, and it was just some monster with one human-looking eye. But he shuddered as they made eye contact again, and with a resentful huff, Claire swore to do whatever she had to do to turn the monster into a man if he wasn't one already, and she went off to gather supplies. Less of her murderer friends returned to him with her, and Roxy, along with Laren, had supplied her with rope. Claire could hear the festivities beginning and was glad that she would be left alone to try and convince the man they weren't going to kill him, even if Michael still might if Claire did not do enough tonight. She wondered how much was enough, and what she would do if Michael said no. Swallowing this panic within herself as she became conscious of time and her limited 12-and-a-half-year-old abilities, Claire handed another cooked potato to him. She could only get her fingers halfway through the cage bars with the potato in hand almost too wide itself, but she didn't want to just throw it at him like Elder Michael had. Claire couldn't believe that Michael had called the man a thing and it. Sure, he was acting like a feral animal, but she had just seen these people act like animals themselves just moments ago.
What's wrong with you? Can you not see it's a person?
She had to fight not to scream at them, at older Michael when he talked about the orc slave like he was the monster here. They hadn't even spoken to him. They just talked about killing him. His sob, the feeling of hunger and neglect, it spoke to her deeper than any sermon ever could. He looked at the potato. Then he looked at her like she was a demon he was selling his soul to.
You can take it,
she said encouragingly, giving the spud a little wiggle. The man just sat up an inch before hitting the back of the cage hard again, shaking numbly and wiping more spit from his mouth.
I ain't gonna hurt you,
she repeated. He, obviously, did not believe her. Claire set the potato down in the snow and nudged it through the bars. Her hand was no less than an inch away and it was in his mouth. With shocking speed, he crossed the distance and crashed into the cage wall head first in his frantic effort to get at the food. He almost bit his hands while he crushed it into his face and between his fingers and gagged as he near manually shoved it down his throat while he threw himself back against the back of the cage, coughing and whimpering and curdling into a tight, terrified ball even while he licked his filthy, broken fingers.
You don't have to eat so fast.
Claire couldn't help but parrot the words a soup kitchen worker had told her once. Claire hadn't listened to that woman and doubted the man in the cage would listen to her either. He covered his face, pulling his legs and arms in, to quietly pant and sob to himself as he continued to choke down the food.
You okay? I'm not gonna hurt you,
Claire insisted. She felt like her heart was bleeding, but she wasn't even sure he'd hurt her.
If you tell me your name, I'll feed you more,
she offered. The man coughed hard before gulping breath and protecting his head and singularly intact body part. His one blue eye was shaking hands. Watching him with a quirked jaw, Claire wanted to feed him again, response or no.
How about Blue, okay? We can call you Blue for now, until you can say your real name. My name's Claire, and I want to help you and make you feel better. Okay, Blue?
She really wanted him to reply, okay, but he just continued to huddle in the cage's corner. In a few minutes, Claire had her lasso ready. She had the trap and bait perfectly set, and with a scaly apex predator hunter's resolve, she planted her feet to be ready. Where he couldn't see her, she swung the cage door open, and as planned, the man lunged out with a single clawed arm to snatch the bait. An apple. Claire cut the draw line, and the snare's cord whipped around his wrist, yanking the arm into the air, and then she pounced on him, colliding with him with all her weight, punching the man in the head and trussing him up tight and fast enough to give them both rope burn. He shrieked with terror and desperately tried to lurch back into the cage, looking up at his traitorous hand that could not be freed from the small noose that suddenly bound him to the tree. It was as though the man never saw Claire coming, as though he hadn't just watched her set up the very trap she'd just caught him in. He sobbed between screams as he fought her, and once he was bound, Claire stood up. She had to. The man smelled so horrible when she tackled him, she was afraid she would vomit on him. Looking at him now, as he struggled and seized and trembled in the snow and cried out in terror and pain, Claire then wanted to vomit because of the sheer amount of pity bubbling up at her throat. The girl steeled herself and her stomach and quickly gathered her other ropes.
If you calm down, this'll be easy,
she gently informed the man, even as he lost it when he saw her approaching again. She worked quickly then, as he was pulling on the arm in the snare so hard while trying to retreat back into the cage that the skin of his wrist was threatening to tear. As she tied him tighter, the man slowly seemed to resign himself to his perceived fate and stopped fighting so hard, just twitching and miserably whimpering more. She cut the snare and ripped his hand down to add it to his other wrist. She then untied the original binding, leaving him with just a relaxed hog tie, enough to keep him from running, but not enough to be a stress position. After this, he didn't fight her much more, only pressing his face and body as much as he could into the snow to cower from her. Claire then dragged him onto the tower shield she had borrowed from a dead orc, and pulled this makeshift sled across the orc camp and into her tent. With even a molecule of heat from the wood stove fire she had going, the stench of him was overpowering. Claire reached right for the scissors from the kit of tools she had laid out, and he whimpered down to his soul, but barely struggled. She watched him bolt his eyes shut and then tense beneath her as she raised the scissors above him. Claire had only ever seen that acceptance of pain appear on faces of people that Michael had broken in torture. "I'm not going to hurt you," she told him again. He did not appear to understand or hear or believe her, but he also didn't try to move or run away, and so she started shearing at the matted hair and rotten furs. Claire quickly realized that her promises to him had been and would be a lie. It was obvious that breathing on him too hard would hurt him. She had gasped in horror as she removed his makeshift shirt, observing the wasteland of scars and injuries and open infected wounds. The girl had been hoping that it was just his hands that were rough, and she realized no. The mangled, broken claws that sported exposed bone, gangrene, and frostbite perfectly matched the rest of him. She could see absolutely every bone in his ribs and could stack coins in the recesses of his collarbones. The man's hips stuck straight up like moose antlers. He was like a skeleton covered in bleeding, bruised, and moldy vellum. She'd seen adult males naked before, since the Merculians were a hedonistic bunch, and she'd accidentally walked in on a homeless man who'd been urinating in an alley once. So when she started cutting his pants, she mentally prepared herself to see an adult male naked up close for the first time and probably have to clean said man. And she didn't know if that part of the body could also get frostbite, but she was then even more horrified to the point where she almost screamed, as instead of them being there in whatever bad shape they were likely in, they were nowhere to be seen. Scars where they were supposed to be, yes, but they were in fact gone. She threw a towel over his waist anyway, and saw stars as she numbly moved on, and pulled off his excuses for shoes to see a gradient of mummified black toes, to dry exposed bone and tendon, to wet infected rot, and at last living but horribly dirty and scarred skin. She could see all the way through a necrotic hole between a few metatarsal bones. Claire just hoped his broken-looking wrist, the one she'd caught in the snare, was already broken before, and that she hadn't done that. She went outside, throwing the revolting leather and fur as far as she could away, and then tried to avoid looking at anyone while quickly taking an envelope of heroin off the potluck drug table and going back inside. He hadn't moved even a centimeter while she was gone, save the involuntary, labored wheezing and trembling. He appeared to have only opened his eyes to look around the tent, and then quickly closed it again as she came in. He looked like a zombie dandelion, all bony, bloody leathered twigs with a big puff of hair on top. The smell was still bad, but not nearly as overpowering. She tacked open the door just a smidge and put a pot of snow on the stove to melt. Taking smaller scissors this time, and unfortunately getting a reaction very similar to the first, she started sawing at his matted hair, tossing chunks to the side. When the water was hot, Claire stood back to admire her work. Hair and beard gone, his face was also an absolutely gory wasteland. He reminded her of a dead body she had seen once. One that an alligator had bitten head first and rolled and dragged under. She looked at him head to toe again, and it was so horrifying that she really couldn't comprehend it. Every detail distracting her from the last, so she couldn't process any of them, and had no idea where to start. She shook her head and tried to look at just his eye again. And as she did, the girl realized, beard or not, the man had not one single wrinkle on his face. As he shivered on the floor, Claire waited for him to look at her. While she was watching his squeezed tight eyelids, a tear formed and fell from them, hitting where others had fallen to form a tiny puddle. Perhaps wondering why she had stopped, the bruised, bloodshot blue eye opened up to her again, accidentally meeting hers. She looked past the emaciation, the holes where his right cheek and eye used to be, the blood, the scabs, the pus, the mottled lumps of scars. He wasn't a monster in a cage. He wasn't a man driven insane by torture. In that moment, Claire realized that he wasn't a man at all, but a boy. Claire forced down tears as her heart cracked and she let out a broken whisper. "How old are you even, Blue?" She wanted to hug him very badly, but he was still covered in mud and waste and blood and green pus, so she started to clean him off. At her moving even an inch, his eyes shut tight again, and he just tensed in his bonds, the aggression in the cage having always been just a show, as he was far too hurt and sick and scared to fight. The boy jumped as she touched his face with the wet rag, panting hard for a moment through his clenched and broken teeth, not even having to move his jaw to breathe through his mouth, as it couldn't close. Every time she touched him, he flinched, occasionally opening his eye in panic before cringing it closed in fear again. Claire remembered the heroin and dipped a spoon into the envelope, after which she pulled a burning stick from the stove to hold under it. Claire had forgotten that nearly half of his scars were burns, but he remembered as soon as he felt the heat and opened his eye. His entire body seized, and he fully screamed through his teeth again, not in pretend aggression this time, but a mournful, begging noise that sounded like it had been ignored many times before. He started struggling and hyperventilating under her, even when she pulled it away and she saw him crying harder while he started to cough from breathing so hard. Claire laid a blanket over him and half laid on top of him, afraid to hurt him, disgusted by his infections, but unable to resist hugging him a moment longer. He yelped at first, but then just wheezed. The longer she embraced him, the more his whimpers sounded confused and anxious, but that was better than terrified. "You will be better by morning," Claire vowed. Sometime before dawn, Michael was woken up by bewildered whispering. He had passed out at some point in the night, and his limbs were stiff from lying with nothing but a pelt between him and the snow and the nude for however long he'd been out there. He assumed the cold getting into his joints had finally woken him up because despite his power and species and position next to a god, he was very old. While his human form appeared to be about 40 years of age, it was really the same one he'd been using for nearly 180 years now. He acquired pants and magically cured his fledgling hangover to see what the fuss was about. Some of his people were crowded shoulder to shoulder, some also having woken up for bodily functions, or because they were at last sober enough to get to a comfier spot, or they were still drunk and high and hadn't gone to sleep at all yet. They were standing near the thin opening of a small tent that Claire usually claimed as hers on nights when there were parties and some folks would be sleeping outside so she could have the place to herself. But as he approached, they parted for Michael, and he was also amazed at what he saw. Claire was there, exhausted looking, but still working hard. She was currently sitting on top of the thing's midsection to hold it down, and scrubbing away black tissue from a bedsore on its hip with a soft bristled brush. Beside her, there were tweezers, bandages, scalpels, narcotics, a dozen now filthy rags covered in dirt and pus and blood, and a few remaining clean ones. She had a bowl of still-moving maggots and paused in peeling this necrotic tissue up to take the tweezers and add one more worm to the bowl, taking a razor and cutting off a flap of rot and filth as the thing shuddered beneath her. Now that the hair which had created mystery around the creature sat in a reeking pile outside the tent, Michael himself couldn't help but gasp as many of the others had before him. "That thing was fucking human?" "Still is human," someone said softly, as Claire was too focused to answer. "Technically always was." They spoke with awe and wonder in their voice, but also taking advantage of Michael's surprise to be a smartass. "Or maybe a half-elf," someone else numbly countered. "Hard to tell with most of his ears ripped off. And his eye. And most of his lips. And his cheeks. And his nose. And all the scars." Michael agreed. All he could tell was that the now mostly clean human was pale, and what hair Claire had let it keep was blonde. Another began. "Claire cut off what he had over his legs, but wrapped the blanket over him before any of us saw. She's been working one body part at a time, like feet to face, because the frostbite was worst on his toes." This person pointed out the bandages freshly wrapped around the human's feet and ankles. There wasn't much to be seen of his feet, as the gauze was so thick, but both of the ankles were facing the wrong direction, as if they had been broken. "Don't know how long he's had it. Some toes already gone. A few dry bones sticking out. She cut off all the gangrene. One or two can probably be saved," they informed him. "I've just said all that to say we technically don't know if it's a boy. We're just going with that based on there's no boobs, and the more intact-looking parts of his jaw are pretty square. But he could be just that starving, or they could have cut them off. He doesn't have nipples as far as I can see either. Well, him or her. He had a full beard," Someone else fully scoffed. Oh, he did? I must have not been there for that part. She didn't fucking shave him, bro. Look at the stubble. Oh, I didn't see it through all the scars. And hey, a girl having a beard is nowhere close to the weirdest thing we've seen, man. Ignoring them. The more he looked at the creature that was supposed to be a human, the more Elder Michael still couldn't decide if it was a monster. Michael could see now that its legs were broken in multiple places, and they had been for who knew how long. One knee was twisted, and so was the connecting ankle, so that foot was almost entirely backward. In more than 3 places, he saw bone spurs from old fractures distorting the skin and threatening to puncture it, one of which already had, and the bone shard emerged more than an inch out of his leg with inflamed and oozing skin that had been trying and failing to grow around it for some time. Claire had mostly cleaned around that spot and was doing some final touches before bandaging it. She apparently touched a nerve then, and the boy flinched, reflexively pulling on the rope around his broken hands against his broken legs and giving a sharp cry as he appeared to hurt himself more than Claire was hurting him. She paused while waiting for him to stop squirming, and the thing did eventually, exhaustedly shivering while pressing his wrecked body into the blanket she had him on. The ropes tying his hands were expertly done, even if it obviously hurt when he struggled against them. Loose enough to not cut off circulation, but tight enough to where the creature boy wasn't going anywhere. Michael wondered if one of the kinky members of the group tied it for her, or if she had just already known how to do it herself. Either way, the thing was exhausted, exposed, raw, and Claire was only holding it down because the remaining movement was involuntary. Continuing to study what he could see of the thing, Michael noticed that Claire had also debrided large bed sores from his back and several of the bonier points of his emaciated body that he must have habitually laid on in the confines of his cage. She hadn't fully bandaged them yet, and the same was true for what looked like several abscesses and a hematoma she'd emptied. Perhaps she was letting them drain first. There were a few more wounds that she hadn't gotten to at all, save washing the dirt and hair off, but clean or not, everything was infected. More recent injuries looked like dog bites, which wasn't surprising where they found him. His hands weren't in much better state than his feet, fingers missing where they had been dislocated or broken and healed and broken and healed and broken over and over for years now, to all look like gnarled tree roots topped off with frostbite. He was very hunched and had thick calluses on his knees from walking on them instead of his feet, and Michael wasn't sure he had any skin where there wasn't scars. Granulated nodules from old burns or infections rose up like tumors from all over his body, distorting him even further as though he had flesh-colored wax stripped all over him, from small ribbons to large and mottled lumps. They coated him in endless layers like a tapestry of history to do with pain. Worst of all was his face. Claire had loosely tied a bandana around his mouth, likely giving him something to bite down on more than a muzzle or gag. The boy had hardly any lips. Almost his entire right cheek had been ripped off the constantly exposed, broken, jagged, and meningitis-stricken teeth as he could no longer fully close his mouth. It was unclear what had taken his right eye, but the socket was just a deep pit loosely covered with angry scars. His nose was down to the wick, too, just 2 misshapen holes in the center of what was left of his face. All that was left was bone, and maybe he had lost some of that, too. Perhaps the only thing still intact on his head was the one remaining eye. Bloodshot to hell, but still a light blue. Cutting something else out, Claire made him flinch again, which made him move again, which caused him a great deal of pain again. He was panting hard and laboriously through the makeshift muzzle after having been in a state of panic basically all night. He was almost too tired to even express that he was in pain anymore, just pleading whimpers and softly hitting his head on the floor as it was the only thing he could move. Seeing this, she paused in her cleaning. The thing that had mostly been making him crack was that she would scrape out pus or necrotic flesh, and then pour a few drops of whiskey into the wound that she'd been working on. Even Elder Michael would have flinched at that. She took a clean rag and murmured to the boy in a mothering tone, and consoled him with whispered baby talk before wiping a tear from his eye that Michael hadn't noticed. Then a bit of spit from his shredded maw, before picking up a spoon Michael realized was holding heroin, and she burned it below the boy creature's nose, forcing him to breathe the fumes in. Waiting for it to take effect, she used some scissors to straighten out his new haircut, where she'd missed a few spots. The boy trembled as the candle-sized fire drew near him, and he also glanced up at her and the scissors in terror as she switched to those, but even through the haze of pain and drugs, he didn't move a muscle. After a moment, when Michael assumed she felt he was at least somewhat numb again, Claire went back to her work. Claire showed no sign of stopping all night, others even getting tired of watching her or just too tired to watch anymore, and they went to bed. Michael even left her eventually, pondering by his injuries or a drug overdose if the boy would be dead by morning. In the morning, the camp was quiet. Everyone had a hangover. Elder Michael woke as he did every morning that he slept in a bed, spooning his little quarter dragon doxy. From smelling his hair at the nape of his neck, Michael trailed his nose to Lewis's cheek and licked the entire length of the seam behind the young man's ear, ending in gently biting it. It would never cease to amaze him how Lewis woke up every day sharp as a knife without even sleep in his voice. Lewis informed him before even opening his eyes. "I did you last night 'cause I was high. As for this morning, you still smell like orc blood, and you don't have the orc-sized dick to make me look past that." "Racist today, are we?" Michael purred into his ear. "I don't mind green as long as it's clean, and I'll remind you that you're the one with the dragon fetish." "That's not why I like screwing you, darling," Michael whispered while affectionately groping him under the sheets. Lewis lazily slapped his hands away and rolled over. "I would ask you what the real reason is, but the only thing I want from you right now is coffee." Rolling his eyes as he got out of bed to put a kettle on, Michael wondered who was more of a pain in the ass to who in their relationship. He vowed to make it hard for Lewis to walk next time. He couldn't let the damn twink win. After caffeine, a bath, making Lewis scream a little after all, and then getting a massive headache as the sun against the snow was way too damn bright, Elder Michael went to Claire's tent. The disgusting leathers, balls of hair, used gauze, rags, and the globs of blood and goop that were now frozen to all of these were still in a pile outside. Michael saw a small, unknown bone in this pile too, and hoped it belonged to a rabbit, but wasn't sure. A bit away from this, there were also bowls and spoons sitting in the snow that appeared to previously have soup in them. Ducking in, Claire was asleep on her small mound of blankets that she had for a bed, and she had made a similar bed directly next to hers for the boy. The girl had found him some clothes, a flannel shirt, a very baggy sweater, thick long johns, and oversized wool socks. All of these she had gently put over the bandages. She had retied him to make him more comfortable by binding his arms to his chest so his knuckles were touching his chin and elbows touching his sides, and then simply tied his ankles together. The boy was also asleep, on his face, drooling from his wrecked mouth onto the little bed Claire had made for him on the floor next to hers. She had rolled up blankets and tucked them into his sides so he couldn't roll over onto his bed sores. The boy trembled a little. Asleep or not, his one eye was closed, so Michael wasn't sure, but he probably laid on the bed sores so much because the other parts of his body hurt too much to put pressure on. Michael realized then the boy wasn't asleep, or that he had just woken up because he was trying to raise his hips off the floor. The boy's back was horribly hunched, and he looked like he was going to break his neck from being straightened out. The girl was trying to help, but she was also lightly torturing the boy in the name of his health. Who knew how long he'd been fighting this position, trying not to be in pain or suffocate himself. Michael usually loved torturing people, but this was just sad. The boy turned absolutely terrified as Michael entered his eye line, and he realized the 2,000-year-old demon was there. Even so, he didn't scream to protest or call for help. He just snapped shut his eye, screwed up his face in dread, trembled, and braced himself. He just accepted whatever he thought Michael was going to do to him. It was delicious. Craveable, actually. A truly broken person. No fight, just at your mercy, too worn down to even bother begging you to spare them. Michael wished Lewis would shut the fuck up like that sometimes. For now, however, Michael kicked the blankets away from the boy and continued to use his foot to roll him over onto his side. This made the boy yelp in either fear or pain at last, and Claire shot up out of her sleep to see Michael resting his boot on her hard-fought-for pet. The boy immediately resumed a more comfortable C shape and just breathed hard on the ground now, his only eye toward the floor, still waiting for the beating. "He's better," Claire decreed from her bed. Reluctantly, and only inwardly, Michael agreed, removing his foot. Being able to tell what had been a mystery creature was now a human teenage boy was an improvement no matter who spun the facts. Michael felt that he couldn't kill the boy now, even though he was still suffering. He was probably a little more hurt now that he'd received a 10-hour full-body surgery from a 12-year-old and had been conscious the whole time. Michael marveled at the pain tolerance the thing must have had. He'd been drunk and high most of the night, but he hadn't even heard the thing scream once as far as he could recall. He didn't really care that the thing was in pain, but he'd expected her to give up, and since she obviously hadn't, if he still killed the boy, Michael felt that Claire would harbor resentment. Her turning on them would be a shame after all the work that had already been done to convert her. They were cruel, to be fair, but they couldn't be cruel to their own. Morale depended on it. He would be a waste of time, resources, and grief for her when he did pass from his injuries because there was no way he wasn't going to, but perhaps then she would see that life was a waste. You can keep him if you keep taking care of him. I still expect you to help around camp as well. Claire gasped in delight, before retaining her stubborn child composure, and determinedly accepted this. Maybe she would do well as a cleric then. Become one of our master's powerful few healers, Michael thought as he tried to find a silver lining to the situation. In a show of good faith, Michael went so far as to focus the small amount of non-destructive magic he had recovered in his sleep after the battle into the boy, to clear up some of the infections, as every bit would count. Claire was ecstatic about this, tumbling out of bed and checking everything's progress. The boy looked high both from the drugs Claire had given him and the rush of healing energy. As the magic went through him, he collapsed in relief and almost moaned, relaxing his tense shoulders for once, taking deep breaths instead of panting, and pressing his mangled face into the blankets to feel how soft they were instead of the hide. Claire touched his cheek while his eye was closed, and he jumped, yelping again as every movement was agony, but then just breathing through his clenched teeth, not whimpering like he had before, even in his terror, as the magic still felt incredible. She softly apologized before gently scratching the unevenly cut hair behind his ear as though he were just a 110-pound puppy. Stretched out, Michael estimated the boy was probably in the upper half of the inches above 5 feet. He was very likely shorter due to malnutrition and trauma, and would be even smaller due to the permanent hunch formed by living in a cage. With the state of his legs, Michael knew it would take an act of God for him to stand, much less walk, so crawling, Michael supposed he might as well be a dog. He flinched a bit again when Claire undid a few bandages and poked a wound that was suddenly free of pus that had built up in the night, and immediately went to completely removing the soiled strips of fabric to put on clean ones, and re-cleaning the wounds to ensure he didn't just become infected again. As he left, she gushed after him, "Thank you, Elder Michael," and he gave her a 2-fingered salute off his forehead as he bowed out. Claire eventually came out to clean up her pile of biohazards. Michael saw from where he was directing some others who were awake and less hungover that morning to places he wanted looted first. He watched her also notice the bone he had seen, and then he watched the girl ponder it and then put it into her pocket. The rest of the mess she took to the pile where they had dragged the orc corpses to either burn later or just leave frozen depending on how much spare time and effort they had on their way out. He watched her go to the resident cook's breakfast station, mostly just recooked leftovers from their feast last night or the remaining prime picks from the orcs' stores. The girl got 2 plates, and others seemed to ask her questions, but she made her way quickly back, not letting them follow her into her tent. She held true to her promise, though, later helping them loot and clean up enough to do her part, and having the restraint to only go into her tent once every hour or so to check on the boy. During the lunch break, another medic and cleric went in to check her work as she brought him some soup, and a few minutes later as they left, Michael noticed that they looked impressed, and as he read their lips, he saw them say something about teeth. At another break, he saw her pause, sitting down on a barrel. After catching her breath a bit, she absently took out a familiar bone and started rubbing it against the barrel rim, scraping blackened cartilage off it. Michael moseyed over, and Claire jumped a bit when she saw him. He was unnaturally quiet, and she was still very far from used to his presence. "Is that bone from the boy?"
"I'm calling him Blue for now, and yes, one from his feet."
"I mean, I would expect that from one of the others," Michael started to mumble, thinking of a few that liked to collect teeth and ears, but Claire reassured him.
"I wanted to keep it in case he got lost, so maybe someone could scry on him or have a dog smell him. And I don't know, but it feels weird to throw part of him away. I took other rotten bones off his feet and hands, but then it'd also be weird to keep all of them, so I compromised and just kept one. I don't know what I'm going to do with it. Making it into a necklace or something feels weird too. And I don't know if he'll realize it's his if he sees me with it. That'd be awkward. How's he doing? Better, the girl made sure to insist, but regretfully also admitting, he's always asleep when I go check on him, and usually he doesn't even wake up unless I make a lot of noise. I figure that means he at least feels kinda safe, and he is probably really tired from being hurt and cold all the time. I don't know if he knows we freed him, he is still tied up. He's still super scared of me, and when I tried to feed him breakfast, he just got scared and almost didn't want to eat. I know he's hungry, but I almost had to make him, and he kept freaking out. I left him food out where he could get it, but he just looks scared and sad and stares at it. Like maybe he thinks I'll hurt him if it eats it.
The orcs probably did that to him, Michael agreed. A somber voice to her, but he inwardly put that as a note in his brain of ideas to try with the next person they kidnapped.
Yeah,
Claire said sadly, looking at her feet and then the bone and then back to her tent.
I barely even have him tied up now. I just chained his more hurt leg to a chest in there. He hasn't really tried to escape once, doesn't struggle or pick at the ropes or anything.
He still hadn't talked?
No. I think he's too scared to, or he's gone crazy, or maybe he can't with his mouth so fucked up.
Michael tried to keep the tone light. Does he still have a tongue?
I think he lost some of it, like bit it too hard once or something, but yes. I think we need to pull some of his teeth out too, though. Some of them have black stuff. I don't think he's ever brushed them. I saw one bleeding after he ate some stuff, and he pulled out something white and hard out of his mouth earlier, but I don't know if that was part of a tooth or just a tonsil stone or something.
Michael frowned a bit to ponder that. He figured that the exposed bone coming out of the boy's leg or multiple other broken bones were more important. But if the girl and the other medics had decided teeth were a priority, then who was he to disagree? He'll probably freak out and think we're torturing him, but we could put him on the rack to keep him from struggling. Janelle's good at pulling teeth. Claire raised an eyebrow and looked inward to consider that, eventually supposing,
he can't get more afraid of us than he already is, and maybe his mouth hurts and that makes him being afraid to eat worse.
We'll do it after dinner, Michael easily promised. Get him to eat a bit just before, so in case it's too hard after. Get him really high so it doesn't hurt so bad. Get him off to sleep right after so he heals up enough to probably eat more in the morning. Claire looked up at Michael with hope for what Michael felt was almost certainly the first time.
Thank you,
the girl said in awe. Well, if Blue is to be a part of the group, Michael supposed, knowing full well how significant remembering his name and appearing accepting of him would be to young Claire. It'd be a shame to not do something so easily as pulling out some of his teeth. We need Janelle to teach the other medics how to do it anyway. Claire was so touched that when he put his hand on her shoulder, she easily accepted and touched his hand in return. Michael then patted her back as fatheringly as he could muster, standing and leaving her to it. I could butter her up with that a lot, gain her sympathy more by showing her that we're trying, and by working on him so fast we will likely kill the boy from exhaustion or shock. She'll be sad, but that's less time to get attached. Let her feel like we care and support her, and also get him out of our hair. Pulling Blue's teeth went poorly, overall. The actual dragging him out of Claire's tent, lashing him to the rack that they had tortured the orcs on only days before, ratcheting his mouth open by belting his head down and then pulling a string across his bottom jaw, tying the string to the belt that went around his chest, that went well. Janelle was easily able to explain which tools to use and how hard to grip the teeth to pull them out instead of breaking them off above the gums, how to twist and fully rip them out, how to cauterize a few spots that bled with heated needles. That went well, and their other medics felt confident in their own abilities to do it now. They pulled 7 of his teeth, leaving him with 10 by Michael's count. Michael made sure that Claire kept them so the collectors in the group wouldn't make jewelry or dream catchers out of them, Luckily, the ones that remained were mostly grouped together, so he'd be able to choose still, though Claire had mostly been giving him soup so far anyway. Claire and the other medics had been right to make it a priority to pull them. 2 were severely infected almost down to the bone and even released green pus on their way out. If they'd waited even a day or 2, he might have lost part of his already crooked jaw. The other medics, encouraged by this success, then also had a look at the worst of his 2 legs. "We could re-break this one and tuck it back in," Janelle offered Claire.
"Please do,"
Claire all but cried out. Backtracking after that, she forced herself to act more casual and shrugged.
"Since we're at it."
They then commenced a 3-hour surgery, and when it was over, the lower part of his worst leg was straight again, and all that was left of the granulated, infected mass of skin trying to grow back over the ever-oozing exposed bone shard was a clean line of stitches and intense bruising. They braced it and wrapped it, and some of the stronger members of the group carried him back to Claire's tent, and all of them left her to mother him while he just laid trembling on his little bed, with a hand over his mouth and a few tears falling from his one eye. It had all gone extremely well. Except for the fact that now every single person in camp was now attached to Blue halfway as hard as Claire was. Michael wanted to slap his forehead and swear up and down with annoyance. A sea of pitying faces, forlorn eyes, and sudden offerings of help manifested as soon as they saw the boy whimpering with terror when he was dragged out from the tent and as they heard his feral, pleading screams when they tied him down. Michael overheard a pair of people clearly summarize the situation. "Fucking hell, he's ugly," one said with shock and awe. "Yeah, but so ugly he's cute," another one said with a bursting heart. Michael realized with even deeper ire that Blue had almost instantly become the camp mascot. They'd needed another. The polar bear cub they'd had a year before had been put down after it mauled one of them, but he had not expected Blue to be the thing to take its place. The hopeless pet project that was supposed to last a week, or less, now needed to survive at nearly all costs for the sake of morale. His people didn't give a fuck about. But the emotionally stunted, affection-starved crackhead dillweeds would take 2 full days to have a full-scale funeral for the ward boy if he died now. That was at least as long as the funeral for Perink the bear and Warren Bradford, Perink's victim, had been. Michael got most of them to make what they did okay in their minds by making them make themselves believe that they were doing good in a roundabout way. Subconsciously, they either knew that they were serial killers and just lying to themselves. Their guilt about what they had been at first coerced into doing forced them to believe it and continue on threat of self-destruction. Or they'd done enough drugs to where they actually believed it when Michael said they were saving the world by ending it and sparing people by killing them. He encouraged them to be at least a little kind, intending for them to be kind to each other, but their effort to do this was exhausted because they subliminally still knew that they were only being kind to other bad people. So the little bit of good in his people that Michael hadn't stamped out had finally found a meaningful outlet. The Death Fists had found something that they could genuinely care for without breaking the facade of the bad boy personas they'd all made. They were caring for something that was both pitiful and horrifying, disgusting and precious. He had a picture-perfect puppy dog eye, but he was fucked up enough everywhere else to match the aesthetic. It didn't help that they discovered he wasn't completely broken and helpless, even while he barely fought them out of fear. In the same way he fought being pulled out of the cage, he resisted those helping Claire drag him out of her tent. With just his better leg, he was able to put the brakes on 3 of Michael's fighters, wrench his broken fists out of another's hand, and punch them in the jaw before 2 more joined the first 3 and helped wrestle him down. Something they struggled to do still. Once he was down, though, bleeding through his bandages from several places after the tussle, he resigned himself to his fate again and went limp, only wincing and whimpering, begging them not to hurt him without words. "Fuck me, he's strong," one said with a strained breath as they were basically arm-wrestling Blue to get his arm belted to the rack. Others agreed, and the entire rack creaked when he pulled against the bonds just once in the single moment that Blue gave in to his instincts over fear to struggle, before going slack again and trying to cower from them even while strapped down. But yes, it went too well. So Michael again focused some magical energy into him to clear up the infections. Their god was not known for keeping people alive, even though he needed his followers on Earth to do his bidding, so Michael had little reconstructive magic. But he did what he could, while others in the flock helped Claire clean old bandages to be used again, spoke on more surgeries they could do, herbal medicines, what combination of drugs would curb the pain, and finding more warm and soft clothes to bundle him up in. They asked Claire what she'd been doing for it and realized that the boy had not relieved himself once since they found him, so they made him drink water to the point where they were nearly waterboarding him and came up with a plan for what to do about it since he was likely not housebroken. His cage had been disgusting. But then again, maybe he knew better and just had no other choice at the time. They'd play it by ear and rolled up a corner of the tent's floor, hoping he would use that instead of a rug or blanket in case he didn't know to go outside. The news that the orcs had castrated him spread quickly too, and Michael was fairly certain that was a good thing. At least none of his people would attempt to seduce him now, as it had given Claire the opportunity to make it absolutely clear that Blue was not to be propositioned until he could talk, and perhaps not even beyond. Claire was murderously enraged at the implication made by one of them that she had a crush on him. Most agreed with her, though. He was basically a sad dog, and bestiality was wrong. They were a hedonistic bunch, though, again, and several freaks wanted to know how deep his animalistic tendencies went, to which Claire threatened castration upon every witness who she so much as suspected might even think about it, and to this especially Michael backed her up on. Even if there were one or two freaks with differing opinions, those freaks were well aware of what Michael did to those who preyed on the children or infirm in their own camp, even if the rules were less strict about what they did with outsiders. It rhymed with allaying for life. But Claire laid him up, and while others helped her drug him more, she filled a bottle with snow for him to press against his face, and even more ice packs to press against his other injuries. Blue shook with terror, but was weak and exhausted from screaming and squirming during the surgery, and now he just lightly whimpered under suppressed tears to beg them not to do anything else. They heeded his pleas, though, likely the first time anyone had done so. When she had at last done all she could do for him within a day, Claire tucked him in and kissed his bandaged forehead and let him go to sleep. She hadn't tied him up at all, and Blue was exactly where she left him. Almost the same exact position, too. His bandaged and braced hand over his wrecked mouth, blankets tucked all around him in a cocoon, unfortunately sleeping on his bed sores and bent in his permanent hunch as he was used to from curling up in the cage, but soundly asleep, and breath whistling a little bit through his cheek hole and the even larger gaps between his teeth. Claire got up and checked the sun's position to see what time it was, ever worried that Michael would decide she wasn't helping around camp enough by taking care of Blue too much. It wasn't far past dawn, though, and as she closed the tent flap again, she heard a deep, sudden breath behind her. Turning, she saw Blue quickly shut his eye. Claire sighed as she watched him slowly breathe his waking breath out, and then his breath was short and irregular, along with a few fingers twitching and his eye moving around under his eyelid, as he both panicked and was a bad actor. She sat next to him on her knees, poking his shoulder. He didn't stop pretending to sleep, so she poked him again, and then slowly, fearfully, Blue looked up at her. "Good morning," she said with a smile. Claire predictably got no response. "How bad do things hurt? Do you feel like you can eat?" Blue glanced around the tent before nervously looking back at her and otherwise not responding or moving even a centimeter. Claire put her hand on his shoulder and he flinched, but she kept her hand on his shoulder so long that he nearly relaxed again. "I'm not going to hurt you," she firmly promised. Blue didn't react at all, but Claire knew that his badly bruised jaw and new surgical incision technically disagreed, and therefore it was likely he would too. Claire gathered her will and got dressed, opening the tent to let in the day, hoping she could get him to willingly come outside that day or maybe the next. She pulled his blankets away and made him sit up. While bandaging him, she had learned that he almost acted like a puppet if she was slow and gentle with him. She helped him crawl to the chest and leaned him against it, putting his blankets back over his legs. The girl made certain to be especially careful around the recently operated on leg. He then alternated between nervously looking at her and nervously looking outside. Claire ignored his flinch as she patted his head and wandered away to get them something to eat, soup and other soft things that he could chew with his particular mouth. She came back and almost dropped the plates, she was so shocked. She caught a last glimpse of him dragging himself back into her tent, ambulating in a near crab walk, worst leg and its braces dragging behind as he crawled backwards on the one hand of his better arm and on the elbow of the arm where his wrist and ulna was broken. Claire didn't even go in, both to make sure that he didn't think that he'd been caught or was in trouble, and she just couldn't wait to see where he had gone. Setting the plates down on a tree stump and following the drag marks his worst heel had made, she found several spots of yellow snow, a sigh which filled her with relief. "Okay, so you can't do it when someone's watching you. I totally get it, that's okay," she told him as she came back to find him in the exact position that she'd left him in, but now with a little bit of snow that he'd tracked in and was pretending wasn't there. The blankets over his legs even appeared unmoved. "So you're more clever than you put on, too," she mused. Claire was then nervous that he would sneak away and she'd never know. He'd crept away without her having any idea at least twice already. Then again, it wasn't like he could run fast or far, and they'd be easily able to track him in the deeper snow that no one had walked on yet outside of camp. Claire decided that she would only lock him up again if the weather was bad, and she didn't want him to go out at all. Claire set his plate in his lap and then set herself a bit away from him, handing him a spoon, too. Claire watched him uncertainly hold the spoon, something that was a bit difficult with his few remaining fingers in splints and bandages. He looked at it like she just handed him a puzzle. He alternated between looking very hungry but afraid to eat and then looking confused by the spoon again. She realized that it was his first time with one, or at least it had been so long since he'd last held a spoon that he'd forgotten what it was. She had just let him drink straight out of the cups and bowls so far, or fed him by hand before this. "Like this," Claire said, waiting for him to calm after he jumped at the sound of her voice, and then making a show of demonstrating how the spoon was used. He got the hint for once, and centimeter by centimeter he dubiously copied her, holding it upside down the first time, spilling almost all of it back into the bowl the second, eyeing her suspiciously even as Claire nodded along to tell him he was doing it correctly, but centimeter by centimeter he dumped the soup in his mouth, leaning his head sideways so it didn't fall out, and then tilting his head back as he couldn't form a vacuum in his mouth to properly swallow, awkwardly and nervously maneuvering his tongue to get it all down. Claire figured that maybe that was why he tended to just shove things down whole. Taking the time to chew and let things fall down his throat was not conducive to someone who was purposefully being starved, and then perhaps tortured as payment for the food that might be taken back from them anyway. He then sat with the spoon in hand and just anxiously paused there. Not knowing what else to do, Claire quietly clapped to praise him, and he jumped again, but she took up her own plate and spoon and made an exaggerated show of using the spoon again. He picked it up faster than she would have thought, leaving her pondering about how long he'd been enslaved again. So long that he'd forgotten how to speak, but short enough to where he might have eventually remembered the muscle memory of how to use cutlery. He still looked afraid, not trusting her, every bite tense like he was watching her reel back for a punch. But like this, she got him to eat everything without getting more than a 3 out of 10 on the scared scale. He froze up and locked himself against the trunk with terror as she stood, however, and then just looked confused as she simply took the dirty dishes and walked away. "I ain't gonna hurt you," she affectionately called over her shoulder, leaving him as she went off to do whatever chores still needed to be done. Michael called them to prayer then, however. He said something about getting a prophecy in the night, and while Claire left Blue in the tent, she could see him through the door, looking at her in return while she stood with the others, and a few of them started to chant. Claire had thought they were the town guard, or an adventurer group, when they had found her attacking the thief and went along with letting them help her and acting pathetic to not get in trouble. When they complimented her crime, she then just thought that they were a gang and still went along with it, because she was almost guaranteed to have ended up joining one day when she was old enough to be useful to one. Only when it was too late to leave, she realized they were a cult, and kept going along with it because she was worried they would sacrifice her to their god or something otherwise. But when they were actually nice to her, when they didn't force her to fully join, when they were the first people since her mother died to actually care about how she was, Claire didn't mind that they were a cult so much. As Claire stood in Elder Michael's morning prayer circle, hearing a few folks offer thanks to Mercoul for letting them save Blue,
and then asking for the Dark Lord's continued assistance with fixing Blue, that Blue would be less afraid, that Blue might speak, that Blue might someday join their ranks as a soldier of Merkul himself, Claire felt a weird warmth in her chest. A sobering feeling came over her next. As Claire watched Blue watch her, she realized that she too felt thankful to Merkul for possibly the very first time.
Hey, it's your GM, Bailey Ford. I would like to thank our regular players, Darian, Matt, and Ian, Hip for our cover art, and Tabletop Audio for our background music. You can find us on Twitter at @CIllithids, and thank you especially for listening.